everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's episode is a special one. It's my annual 3-theme show where I welcome a trio of guests to talk with them about their pick for the theme that defined the year in comics in their mind. Each time I do this, my goal is to feature people from different positions in the industry, and this edition changes things up just a little bit. Instead of my usual mix of a retailer, journalist, and person from a publisher, this time it's a retailer, journalist, and a creator, as Steve Anderson from Third Eye Comics, The Beat's Heidi MacDonald, and writer Joshua Williamson star in this one. And it's a great episode, one that starts with Anderson coming on to talk about the challenging place the biggest publisher in the direct market has found itself in, and the area of effect that can have on the world of comic shops. So, without further ado, let's get into that. I am here with Steve Anderson from the Maryland and Virginia comics and nerd culture shop chain. How do you describe Third Eye?
Third Eye is Nerd Disneyland.
Nerd Disneyland. How's the day going for you, Steve?
Going great, man. How about yourself?
You know, besides the aforementioned cat troubles, things are going okay over here. You know, the funny thing is I say that on a specific day. That could be any day for me. So people have no idea when we're recording this. We are here to talk about one of 3 themes for the year. You will be one of the 3 guests. Your big theme for 2024, when I asked you for one, is the state of Marvel. Let's start with your take on that. What is going on with Marvel in your mind and in your shops?
In my mind, I'm trying to figure that out. Marvel's in a weird place. I'm trying to map out what's next for them. And that's kind of where I'm at. In my shops, it's kind of the same. It's really interesting because, last few years, Marvel was kind of like the shining light in terms of being able to have stuff to sell. You know what I mean? And they've had some highlights over the last year. I mean, the X-Men stuff launched strong. It's held its numbers pretty good. The sideline titles aren't performing as well, but the main books are holding their numbers strong. But the thing that I think probably, and the Ultimate stuff obviously is holding great numbers. That's a shining light for them.
I imagine that's kind of the flagship at this point.
For us, I would say that's the thing, right? And then there's some hits there and here and there, like Doom One Shot and things like that. You know what I mean? That you can really get behind. But I think what they're feeling, and I think what I'm seeing for them, and I noticed this around the end of the summer, probably going into September, is that the cover trick is not working for them anymore. And I'm not one of those people who close to it.
You mean variants?
Yeah, you've heard me sing the praises of variants when they work, but I can tell you right now, man, if you look at the last 5 years, a lot of their books launch, and if it's got a few dope covers to it, then you're gonna be all right. You know what I mean? Take I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I mean there's books that launched very strong because they had a few sick alternate covers. And I think that what we're seeing is basically just the readership that kind of responds to that, that's more cover collector oriented, is kind of reaching that point where that readership is no longer the predominant readership, and the content-based readership that's responding to things like Absolute DC, Energon, Ultimates is the thing. The reason why it's alarming is Marvel, the way they move is the way the industry moves, they're a big deal. And without having a strong Marvel, and I've been there before where they haven't been strong, it's always a concern because they are kind of the tide that brings people through the stores. And if they're not exciting the Wednesday weekly comic periodical demographic that's coming through stores now, then that's a harder push for other publishers to be able to get those books in front of eyes, because that's typically how it works.
Well, and it seems like the reason why this is a good fit for the theme for, at least from your perspective, from a retail side, is that it's really that two-pronged approach, that two-pronged impact. One, Marvel's number one, and when they're weak and they're not selling to readers, and I know that your whole thing is, content driven, having good books is what's driving things, and if Marvel's not necessarily doing that, that's bringing in a major weakness. So Marvel not doing well limits the sales on your biggest publisher. And then on the other side of it is it has an area of effect, because when you don't have that tide coming in, the other publishers start feeling that as well.
Yeah, they don't get that level of exposure that somebody coming in for I think the last non-ultimate thing that really excited and stimulated people was probably Blood Hunt. Blood Hunt did really well, but there wasn't a thing after it to kind of launch people into, you know what I mean? And I think that that's kind of like been the thing with Marvel for the last few years is basically when the audience responded well to new number ones, new covers, etc., and was more of a collector based audience, I think that they were fine. But I think we're starting to see that that audience is no longer the majority buyer now, and there's not a lot coming from Marvel that's going to hit the people who are buying the hell out of some of the other stuff like Energon and Absolute and stuff like that.
This is something you're seeing in your shops, and you have a number of shops, so you have multiple data points. You get that sense across a bunch of different customers in different locations. I've heard this from other people too. Actually, I had somebody who had talked to you recently on this very subject, and they're like, "Have you written about this?" And I'm like, "I wrote about it last year." Do I want to write about the exact same subject when almost everything I said is still true?
Yeah.
But do you have a sense of how other shops are kind of feeling about this subject? Is it kind of the same where it's like there's a lot more question marks than usual?
Yeah, I think so. I think people are probably feeling the same to a degree. I don't think a lot of retailers are given the time to think about these things like this. Like there's a lot of SKUs coming at us every week with FOC. There's always a new thing to promote, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't have a team to help carry that load, it's hard to take a step back and be like, these last 3 Marvel catalogs are whack. Like what's going on? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
what's happening? Like,
well, I mean, okay, so from a reader's standpoint, I did a superhero State of the Union not that long ago with the AV Club's Oliver Sava. And one of the things we talked about is like, for all intents and purposes, from a pure readership standpoint, there's only really like 5 books that are kind of really actively exciting to like take on every month. 4 of them are from the Ultimate Universe. So you got the 4 Ultimate books. And then the 5th one is Ryan North and Ibn Coelho and even Ivan Fiorelli's Fantastic Four. And then besides that, it's just kind of like, I don't know, we were talking a little bit before we started recording where there's just so many books right now across all publishers that it's kind of like mush to some degree where like you get kind of lost and stuff. And I think Marvel is maybe more guilty of that than others because you look at the X-Men line. I'm glad that you said that has done well for you, but at the same time, I think like the idea that they have so many books and that offers something for everyone. I don't know if that idea totally works as well as they want it to, because there's so many, it kind of makes it hard to choose from all of them.
I would agree with that to a point. I think a lot of it is just the approach. Like I think the strategy of how they're putting the books out is a strategy that worked extremely well.
The collector-centric one?
Yeah, because like I'm thinking about like take Psylocke, for example. You know what I mean? Like 2 years ago, that book would have sold through like a mother. You know what I mean? It didn't perform the way I was expected to. It's not a bad book. I mean, honestly, there's not a lot of bad books coming out of their line. The books aren't bad, but there's just not like a strategy that's hitting the audience that is getting Wednesday comics right now.
It's aiming at an audience that used to be the most dominant, and now that one isn't, and they're not serving the current top audience.
Exactly. Like the books that we need more of is we need not necessarily Ultimate Universe, but we need books with that kind of approach. I mean, take that approach, that tight, cohesive approach that they're using across that small line, apply that to the mainline titles. It's like, so like Doom, for example, the Sanford Green book, that book was easy to promote and hand sell because it looked cool, man. Like there's some pages in it where you're just like, holy shit, this is great. You know what I mean? The Ultimates has hooks where you can do it. There's not a lot of stuff where you can like get out there and like say like, here's the hook, here's what it is. And I think it's because the strategy is very reliant on like a really good cover program, which they have. The cover program is great. It's just, there's not as big of an audience for those kind of covers like we were seeing a couple years ago, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have to admit, I omitted one book that I really love from my favorite ones to read from Marvel, Aliens versus Avengers. That one's easy to point to.
And you know what? That's selling through. That's doing great.
I mean, it's so easy to point to. It's got this really focused story. It's like Marvel the end, but with the aliens from a top-notch creative team. Easy hook.
Yeah, that's it. That's what you need. And like, we just don't have a lot of those. And like, there's a lot of like, here's a new Moon Knight. Here's a new story for this. Here's a new story for this. But nobody knows what to follow. So like what happens is the Marvel fan base is kind of like fatigued in a way. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I've been saying this line for a while to the point where it probably just feels like I have like an axe to grind or something like that. But I do think one of the interesting things about Marvel is like, I know this is probably blasphemy. Everyone's going to be like 1961 to like 1968 was the best time for Marvel. I actually think that like 2004 to like 2012, like the peak Bendis Avengers era was actually one of the best.
No, I would agree with you.
Yeah, I think that era was amazing because everything was so tight and cohesive. Like something happens in Civil War, it goes into the next storyline. This storyline goes into the next storyline, and you feel that everywhere. And like that's like the kind of cohesion you're talking about that's missing to some degree, where it's like you kind of know where everything fits. And I think to some degree for readers rather than collectors, maybe that feeling is kind of missing.
That's missing. The other thing that I think is missing is there's not a lot of moments. And you have to have these in comics. It's why, I mean, Absolute is filled with these moments right now.
Oh, yeah. Batman AF.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You need the "that shit is cool" moment. That is what a comic shop needs, is they need to be able to, like Thor God of Thunder. You flip to the Frost Giants on the spikes, hanging in the, when he's walking through and you're like, this shit is cool. You know what I mean?
The fist pump moment.
Yeah. You have to have those moments to be able to show people. You know what I mean? Civil War, you got Tony and Cat and Steve Rogers, facing off and he's jumping on the plane. The Absolute stuff has that. And even like the Superman, like the Wonder Woman, like they've got, like they all three have those moments. And like the Energon universe has the same thing. You flip to that back of that first issue of Cobra Commander and you see Megatron. That shit is cool. Like that's what it is. And there's just not a lot of that stuff. And you're like, you need that. And that's what I think is missing. Marvel right now reminds me a lot. And man, I'm not trying to throw shade because I mean, like I've done really well with Marvel. I was doing well with them this spring, man. Blood Hunt and like the Scotty variant program did good for us. I've done great with Marvel. You know what I mean?
You just want more out of them.
I just want more. And I know how important they are. The thing that like is missing is just kind of like, they need some books that are a little wild. They need get a little crazy, because that's the audience coming in now. These are all people who grew up Walking Dead, Invincible, Ultimate Spider-Man with Bendis. You know what I mean? These are people who came in, Blackest Night. Like they want wild shit. You know what I mean? Like they're not the audience that wants wild covers. They want wild stuff happening in the comics.
Yeah. So a few questions less about the content and more about what's surrounding it. I mentioned this before. I've written about this subject before last year. How long do you think this has been going on? Because it seems like this isn't new. It's just really kind of hitting it hard in 2024.
This is not working now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that probably for the last like 2 years, it probably got more pronounced.
Mm-hmm.
I think once you got further away from like, trying to think of the last point. I'm trying to think about it in terms of graphic novels. Like what's the last like Marvel graphic novel I just could hand sell the hell out of? I mean, Ultimates I can now, but like before that, I think Moon Knight, the first Moon Knight was probably the last Marvel graphic novel that I can think of that like was a real like hard hitting hand sell that you're selling hand over fist. Maybe Immortal Hulk. I think since like that time period of like Immortal Hulk and like stuff like that, it's progressively kind of just quietly gone this direction where it's like, here's a popular character, here's some dope covers, number one, boom, repeat, 6 issues later. That's what I think. And I think that like now what we're seeing is just the audience isn't responding as strongly to that because it's a new demographic coming in that they respond to something that has like a little bit more going on, you know?
Mm-hmm. When you said Moon Knight, do you mean the Jed MacKay, Alessandro Cappuccio one?
The very first MacKay run.
Yeah. Okay.
That performed very well in trade. I mean, it did have some help from the show, but you know what I mean? Like that did perform really well.
It was still a good book, and it did have those moments you were talking about, which I think is important.
Exactly.
Another thing I think is worth bringing up, you were the person, I believe you're the first person who told me this. You had previously put it to me that DC and Marvel are cyclical. Like when one is up, the other one's down quite often. That's just kind of how it works. Do you think that this is part of that kind of forever orbit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's like anything, man. I mean, it's like pro wrestling, you know? I mean, like WWF goes down, WCW does NWO, you know what I mean? Absolute is NWO, you know, like that. That's it, you know? Like, I mean, I think that that's part of it. In DC, like, my hope is that it's going to light a fire. I do have high hopes for One World Under Doom. I think that's going to be dope. Like, that looks really cool. A lot of the output of Marvel right now just reminds me of like that weird period between like 97, 98 and 2001, 2002. Like lots of characters where I'm like, well, I don't know how to sell that. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's not even bad characters. It's just like, it's just, it's weird. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I went through 30 years of release lists recently for a project I took on Sketch, and I was looking through some of those, and I was like, I cannot believe, I was reading them, and I still cannot believe that those books existed. There was like some really strange stuff from like 95 to 99 in particular.
Yeah. And like, there wasn't like a lot of like crazy, like stunning, like, you know what I mean? Like nothing felt like it all just felt kind of like, here it is. You know what I mean?
I want to share my perspective from a pure customer standpoint, from like a reader's standpoint. The interesting thing to me is that it feels like there's simultaneously in that let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks phase, while also being super safe.
Yes.
It's a very dangerously mild combination that just doesn't move the needle for me. And it's a really weird place to be.
Yep. That sums it up pretty perfectly. I mean, I would agree with you on that. And like I said, man, they do have some stuff that's hitting. Hey, man, I've done well with Marvel before. You know what I mean? Like, I really want to see like a strong plan.
You want to see some big swings.
Yeah, I want to see some big swings. I want to see him get wild.
You mentioned this before. There's the tide that comes in because Marvel customers coming in. There's the tide that goes out because Marvel customers are dissatisfied. Do you have a sense as to what, if any, area of effect that this has had on other products in your shop and beyond?
I don't think we've felt that yet. Like, because I mean, like the Absolute stuff obviously like hit. It really did well. It stole the show. Energon continues to do really well. I don't think it's hit yet. I think what we're seeing is just
the moment before then.
Yeah, like I think we're seeing like basically like a little bit of that, and we're just seeing less. Marvel's a big publisher. They put out a lot of SKUs, you know what I mean? Like if those SKUs aren't getting picked up, you notice it, you know what I mean? Because yeah, people come and get their Absolute book, but we want to sell them other stuff.
Yeah, just really quick for listeners that don't know, when Steve is saying SKUs, he means just basically different comic products. So like an issue and I know, I just want to make sure that they know. But this is a quick aside. This is a fascinating thing I saw in my comic shop. So I always buy my comics in the sports cards department because my former boss, when I worked at the comic shop in Anchorage, he still works there. And so I go back there and I talk about football and basketball and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And when I went back to go check out recently, when Absolute Batman #2 came out, a guy came in who had one comic and was buying sports cards. That was it. That comic was Absolute Batman. And this was not a regular comic buyer. He was buying Absolute Batman. And I thought that was interesting. The fact that this person is only buying Topps Allen Ginter baseball cards and Absolute Batman. That really speaks to kind of like the crossover success maybe those books are having.
Yeah, no, they brought a ton of lapsed and returning readers. They brought a ton of new readers. I mean, honestly, they hit at the perfect time because we're at that point where basically the readership is cycling over. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing basically like the generation that you're always going to have people who are lifers, man. They're diehard. They're going to follow it up and down like me. But like the readership that came in around like 2018 to like 2022, 2023, that was your strong late 90s readership that like was coming back into it. Now they're older. They've got disposable income. They're in that sweet spot of the 35 to 40 Spawn, Venom, dope variant covers. That was it. You know what I mean? Where we're going now is the next generation that's 35 to 40 and that kind of sweet spot for and let me just emphasize when I say sweet spot in that demographic, I mean for weekly periodical comics. There's definitely periodical comic collectors that are older than that and younger than that. It's just, it always seems to be that I'd say 28 on the low end and 43 on the high end is kind of like the window of when people come, like they get back in again.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say like that generation, they grew up in the early 2000s. They came in with anime to a degree with Toonami. They came in with Bendis Spider-Man. They came in with Walking Dead. All of that stuff is very much focused on wild, crazy stories that hook you. That's what we need out of like everybody right now. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, we always want that, but like, I mean, I'm gonna be real with you. It's not always that way. I mean, sometimes people aren't even reading the books. You know what I mean? They're just getting them because the cover's dope. You know what I mean? But like when they want to read the books, you got to have those hooks.
The world of comics is so funny. The fact that you say that is absolutely true. When I had my comic book garage sale recently, I had a couple people tell me that they don't even read; they just look at the art, and I was like, "Sure, yeah, it takes all types."
And hey, man, to each their own. You know what I mean? Like I want to make sure I have as much cool stuff to sell. Whoever the predominant demographic that's coming in is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you don't really. I mean, like you're not like running a cash register in Annapolis or something like that. That's not your day-to-day life anymore necessarily.
I work the floor though.
You do work the floor. Okay.
Yeah, I get in there on New Comic Day. I get in there on Saturdays.
What have you heard from customers on the Marvel side? Is it just kind of a general malaise or what are you hearing?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably just kind of like, there's no complaints. It's just like, there's just no like, I got to get that. You know what I mean? I will say this, Ultimate stuff people are excited for. People talk about that. They like it. They're pumped by it. And they should be. It's great. Across the board, all those books are great. And the Ultimate stuff did also bring in a lot of new readers and it continues to do so. But I can't think of other stuff like that. The X books also have done really well in terms of like, they did bring a lot of lapsed readers back. And there are people who are collecting the line, but it's sticking kind of mostly to the core. You know what I mean? Like your big three, you know, your Exceptional, your Uncanny, your X-Men. But yeah, other than that, there's not like a whole lot of, like, I think the worst thing in the world is when somebody's not saying anything about something.
I was going to ask you about that. In some ways, I feel like you'd rather have people complaining because at least it means they're passionate about what they're reading.
Oh yeah, man. No. I mean, a lot of the stuff with like people talking about things, sometimes the stuff that people are complaining about the most is selling the best.
Superior Spider-Man. That's one I think of.
Oh man, we sold so much Superior Spider-Man. That's what I want. Give me more Spider-Man.
Make people mad.
Yeah, but it was cool.
Yeah.
It had that, this shit is cool. You know what I mean?
Well, and you know, it's funny. I hate to keep making the comp with the Absolute stuff from DC. I said this on Twitter, and God only knows if anybody saw it because Twitter was a wasteland at this point. But I actually think that one of the most powerful things that they did with that book is making the character look so big and over the top.
Oh, yeah.
That people talked about it. Like, people said they were mad, but you know what? They went and bought it just to find out how it makes sense. And once you start reading it, you're like, I don't care. He's big. That's cool. Whatever.
Cool. It's cool. You know, it's something different. It's something wild. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. Like, they got to get wild. That's what they need.
Okay, let's say we are going into 2025. It's we're recording right before December. How can they fix things beyond going wild behind those big swings? What's your recipe in your mind if you could provide recommendations to the team over there?
On my end, just in terms of like stuff to sell, I mean, like I'd say like relaunch the whole line, do something radical, do something like New 52, go hard. Whatever you got lined up after One World or Doom, make it that the summer thing. Start your summer with a line-wide relaunch. Don't hold back. Don't worry about any, like, if it's a mainline title, number one, commit to like, say like an 18-issue run with the creative team. Make sure you have a plan for your artists to swap around so you don't fall off schedule. Put top tier teams on the top tier books. Put rising stars on some of the up and coming books. And basically just do a coordinated effort where you've got, say, 4 to 5 dope launches every month in May, starting with Free Comic Day. Basically, these are the books. Hulk, Thor, Captain America, X-Men, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, basically just something that's going to make a splash and have a direction behind it. Like, don't stagger it. Don't try to do weird stuff where you're doing it later. Don't solicit another series that's just like it that everybody's talking about that comes out a month later. Keep the focus there. Basically, I mean, it's essentially what they did with the Ultimates to a degree. I mean, like, do that on a grand scale with your main continuity and just go ham and don't be afraid to fuck some shit up. You know, like, I mean, like if people get mad, they get mad, you know, like do something wild, you know, like with the success of Spider-Verse and like how popular Spider-Verse was, like, they should make Miles the Amazing Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Like, that should be the book. That should be your flagship. Batman Beyond that, you know, put Peter Parker in there as a mentor, you know, like there's a lot of cool stuff they could do. I mean, like, make the Hulk eat people like he did in the Hulk. Get wild. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I'm not a comic writer. I don't know.
But you want people to be excited, whether that is in a positive sense or like, is the Hulk really eating people sense?
Yeah, because guess what? For every person who's mad that the Hulk is eating somebody, I guarantee you that I'm going to show that page to like 5 or 6 different people, and they're going to be like, yo, I got to check this out.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. There's a real part of me that wonders what lessons Marvel and DC are going to learn from Ultimate success and absolute success. Because I think that there are lessons to be learned about less is more, and about how like a focused line with great creative teams that all fit together is like a really good recipe. But I don't know if those are necessarily the lessons they're going to be learn. It kind of seems like my idea ties in better with your one, where it's like make cool stuff with a real hook to it and then promote it
What
in
happens?
and just see what happens. It's weird how that's a wild idea, but it is kind of a wild idea. Last question for you. You are one of the things I really love about you is even though you're a realist, I would say that you're always hopeful. And that's one of the things that is great. What has you holding on to hope for Marvel and the area of effect that they have on the rest of comics in 2025?
I mean, in all honesty, I mean, like it's comics, man. Like it always turns around. There's always something cool and exciting. Marvel's got a bunch of really talented and smart people working there from top to bottom. I think they're definitely probably looking at what's working right now with like Absolute and things like that. And they're probably cooking up something that's going to, do the thing that we're talking about right now. These things don't happen overnight. And sometimes, sometimes you'll notice right away. You know what I mean? Like, that's just how it goes. It's hard to pivot quickly. Comics is like that. I mean, even on the ground level with us as retailers, sometimes things, will creep up on you and you're like, oh, I got to pivot away from that. I got to minimize that product category and maximize this product category. It's the nature of it. So, I mean, like, I'm very hopeful. I mean, like the only thing that's going to really force that change is like, they're going to look at like sales numbers on things that worked a year or two ago. And then they're going to be like, okay, it's not working. Let me figure out what works here. That's why I'm hopeful. I mean, I'm optimistic because like I've seen this cycle before. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is really interesting where I think people forget about how long this stuff takes. A lot of times publishers have at least like an 18-month planning cycle where it's like, it may feel like they're being really reactionary, but this is a domino that was pushed over. The first domino was pushed over a year and a half ago. And we're seeing that now. I really want to see what they're kind of like, I don't know. I don't want to say wasting time for. Wasting time seems mean. And like, there's a lot of good stuff out there, but they're like waiting for the right moment for something. That's kind of what it's felt like for the last year and a half. I am curious if One World Under Doom leads to that, because I don't normally advocate for line-wide reboots, but I totally agree with you. I do kind of feel like it would give the line focus in a way that it hasn't had in a little bit. Like we were talking about before we started recording, Secret Wars 2015. Coming off of that, it felt like they were building something new and exciting there. And they kind of need that feeling again.
Yeah, like that's the thing. They just need something that's unifying across the line. Because I mean, like, dude, Blood On did great. Like people were collecting all the tie-ins. Like people were hype on it. Like we were doing really good with that. And like there wasn't like anything cool to spring. You always have to have something cool for the retailers to springboard people to next. And like there wasn't, you know what I mean? Like, and that's kind of I think where we're at. But I mean, it takes a while. I mean, I'm realistic. I don't think they're out by any means. Like
no.
They'll probably come back so strong when it comes. I mean, maybe summer, maybe it may take till the next, the third quarter of next year. We don't know, but like, I'm hopeful. I think it's a talented bunch over at Marvel. I think they're super smart. I think that just, it's time to do some different stuff.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Things may be quieting down for the holidays, but not over on Zoop. There's still time to back Megaton Man from Don Simpson and Fantagraphics, The Awakening from Alex Segura, Michael Marizzi, and Dean Kotz, Thunder Guardian from Riley Brown and his son, as well as other live campaigns. More campaigns are coming soon to Zoop from Joe Quesada, Rodney Barnes, Exhibit, and Jonathan Wayshak, and more that are yet to be announced. Zoop would like to thank all the creators who have recently submitted projects and urge all creators to submit your project to Zoop. Click the Submit Your Project link at zoop.gg as they are providing services to even more creators than ever before. And now, back to the show. All right, that was Steve Anderson from Third Eye Comics. And up next is comics journalist Heidi MacDonald from the long-standing and beloved site, The Beat, as she joins me to discuss a big theme that only she could have come up with. And I mean that in the best way possible. Here it is. Heidi, it is Thanksgiving week, and things keep on getting busier and busier. How are things in The Beat's stately manner?
Well, the Stately Manor is, piling up with gifts and more books coming in, and just it's that time of year, David. It's time for gift guides. It's time for buying guides. It's time for sales. It's time for Black Friday. It's time for more things. We want more things. People like stuff. It's one of my real mantras.
Oh, it is a very good year if you like stuff. Even in just comics, it is actually kind of astonishing how many comics have come out this year. I mean, one of the segments I've done for this kind of talks about that a little bit, but I'm doing my end of the year prep for reading as much as I possibly can. There's absolutely no way I can get through everything I want to get through, but it just feels like every day I discover 10 new books where people are like, you should read this for your end of year prep. I'm like, I can't unless I have clones or time travel.
I actually read more comics this year than I did last year. And every time I read one, it was so good. And then I was like, oh my God, this is a masterpiece. Why aren't people talking about this? And then I asked like Zach Squentis, our review editor, I said, did you read blah, blah? Is everything that good? He says, yeah, pretty much. And I was like, wow, the quality is so high. It really is. The quality of what's coming out is amazing.
It really is. It really is amazing. But we are not here to talk about how good comics are. We are here to talk about your theme for the year, the theme from your perspective that sums up comics in 2024. You have by far the best short form. You have 3 words that explain what your theme is. I'm going to let you explain it, and I will say the 3 words. Your theme for the year in comics is something you labeled to me as the big lie. Can you describe what you mean by that for the people who don't know what that means? Because I imagine that's going to be a lot of them.
Yeah, well, the big lie is a secret of comics publishing that is, I mean, pretty much everyone kind of knows it, but it's not really spoken of. But it's that all of these companies, and as we noted, there are a lot of new people coming into comics. At New York Comic Con, it was like, why are there all these new companies, new players, new teams?
You mean comic publishers when you say new company?
Comics publishers, yes, that's what I mean. New publishers on the scene. And they all are, let's look at Ignition Press, IP, as it's called. And they are coming in. This is the new company by Jamie Rich and Philip Sablick and Jeremy Hahn with Eric Gitter. And you know that they are developing these for media. And the whole thing is, we've seen this play over and over again, back when Radical Comics was around, Aftershock, AWA. That's just the A's. And they all come in and say they want to publish, but we all know that really what they want to do is get these comics optioned for media rights. And somehow that's a business model, right? But the big lie is that a publishing company cannot survive on media rights. They have to actually sell books. That's just how it is. Like, that is not even like open to question, because there is a very, okay, I tweeted this, but now links they're never shown on Twitter anymore. And of course, Twitter is so problematic. But back in June, all the way back in June, Rob Williams, the writer, the British comics writer, wrote a piece for his blog that was called How to Get Your Comic Option for Film or TV and What That Really Means. And he kind of just laid it out, like for a creator, he talks about just how much money he makes from this. And I'm going to quote it. I will read. I was told a story a few years ago regarding options, because that's the first level. When what really happens when you sell the media rights? Usually, David, you and I put out a comic book that was called The Foster Cat, and somebody wants to option it. So they're giving us certain amount of money so that they can develop it and try to get a multi-billion-dollar Disney film made out of it, right? So you get the option money. Sometimes the option money is the price of one dinner, okay? So Rob writes, I was told a story a few years ago regarding options and something actually being made. A well-known comics writer had written a creator-owned book. Every year it would get optioned, never made. A nice check would show up every 12 months. Then a very famous film director eventually made the comic with some major movie names in the film. The writer, rather than being delighted, was a bit gutted because it meant the nice option checks would stop turning up. And then he talks about the purchase price. You, production company, like, you get the option. He says, don't expect life-changing sums of money here. It'll be very nice welcome check, far bigger than the option fees. This is when the purchase price, that's when they actually make it. When they, like, if you must read the contract, because media rights are all about it. But when it actually gets made, as a creator, look, I think Scott Snyder was in the writing room of The Witches, which is coming. Is it coming from Amazon? Is it coming from
is, yeah.
Netflix? Amazon. Okay. But he's the writer's room. So he's undoubtedly making pretty good money from that. Absolutely. No question. Because when you're in the room, you're being paid to write scripts, you're getting more money. Still not life-changing money, but the purchase price is not necessarily life-changing money. Maybe it's a year, you will live for a year. Maybe you have some participation in it. And, if it is a big hit, then maybe it is life-changing. In Robert Kirkman's case, it was obviously life-changing. The Walking Dead. Okay. So there are these success stories like Robert Kirkman, and everybody points to him, but it's like, they sold millions of copies of Walking Dead trades, and he would have been a millionaire based just on those book sales, right? As opposed to producing fees that he got as exec producer on the Walking Dead TV show. And of course, now it has spinoffs. So yes, he is the success story. He is the one who has created his own company out of it.
And he did it twice.
And he's did it twice, right? Well, he has had 3 shows. Don't you remember Outcast?
Yes, I do. But I mean, Invincible's, no offense to Outcast, slightly different size of hit. And it also reciprocated back to the comics becoming even more popular.
Correct. But I'm pointing out that Outcast didn't even run for 1 season. I believe it ran for 2 seasons.
Yeah.
On Showtime. And nobody really noticed and nobody really cared.
I think it was Cinemax.
Was it? Yes. I can't Google. I should have Googled it
beforehand.
That's okay.
That's okay.
I'm just saying this was not the worst failure of all times. Why the Last Man, right?
Oh.
Canceled before the run even. Oh, it's true. It's true. It was after all those years. And, I'm sure Brian and Pia got those option checks regularly and enjoyed them. Maybe he's the one that they were talking about.
I have to say, I actually like the Why the Last Man show. I have no idea where the consensus landed on that. I watched it way later. But do you mind if I'm going to bring us back to The Big Lie, though? So The Big Lie, to summarize, it isn't about the creators and the checks and stuff like that. It's the idea that publishers can sustain on just generating movie deals and like adaptation deals and stuff like that. That can be everything you need. I have to say, you really blew my mind. I had not picked up on the fact Ignition Press was IP. Whether or not that was intentional, maybe, I don't know, but that really blows my mind. But what made that your theme for this year? Is it just because there was a bunch of new publishers that kind of fit that bill, or what was the reason for that?
Well, at New York Comic Con, we really did see all these, new publishers coming in, and Ignition Press, had a launch party, and everybody was very excited to see. When everybody heard that Philip and Jamie were teaming up, everybody got really excited, right? And I think when they actually announced what they were doing, with a Hollywood producer dude running it, I think they were a little disappointed, because it was like, again, no offense to Jamie, no offense to Philip, no offense to Jeremy, no offense to Eric. But we saw it with Aftershock, and where are they now?
Do they even exist technically?
They don't. They're bankrupt. They filed for bankruptcy, okay?
Mm-hmm.
AWA, what's going on there?
No idea.
Yeah, David just shrugged. I could see him. He can't see me. He just gave the classic shrug. So, we've seen this business, back in the day, there was Radical. I can't even remember all the companies that launched it. Then there was this thing with, there's this horror imprint at Image.
Are you talking about Ninth Circle with Garth Ennis and everybody? Yeah, Rom V. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Which is funded by the sister of Kimberly Stewart, who is the sister of the owner of Oni Lionforge. And she's a movie producer. So, Hollywood money coming in. And I guess the one that really made it very clear to me was that big Walmart booth that had the Atlas Comics relaunch in it. And again, all these Hollywood players are involved, producer of this and agent for that. And, they got Walmart to put up a little museum to Atlas Comics, and they're very open. Like, they want to make, Devilina, I forget what her name is. Like, she's perfect for movies, and, she would be fantastic. And so they're not hiding it. And, even when AWA started, Axel Alonso and it was Bill Jemis then, they said, well, you know what? We just want to make good comics.
Yeah.
We just want to make good comics because that it's really all about storytelling. And everyone says that. They always say that. But I guess the big lie is also that these people get investors based on the idea that they're going to be the next Walking Dead.
Well, it's the lottery ticket mentality, right? Idea that if you get the right thing, then you're going to be rich. But unfortunately, the cruel reality is a lot of these publishers go away in a few years. And then we are just like, what happened to AWA?
Mhm. Yeah. And where are the rights? And oh, somebody is struggling. I mean, look at heavy metal, like
Hmm.
they have relaunched and they still owe lots of people lots of money, And as far as I can tell, when the guy there, Marshall Lee, said, "Oh, there was been talk about all the money, but we are dealing with that," which is technically true. They are talking to the people that they owe money to. So he technically is correct on that. But I mean, David, I mean, we just see it over and over and over again, right? Like these companies come in and that's their business model.
Do you think that this is accelerating? Like, do you think this is something, because there were a lot. I mean, I was just, when I wrote about the Ninth Circle, the imprint, which has a lot of cool comic creators associated, the thing that really stood out to me was the fact that half of like the opening paragraph was like agent names and stuff like that. And it was like all
Right.
these different companies, like you mentioned Kimberly Stewart, but it's like rounding out the leadership team is AB Goes, Michael Bogner, and TFC Management's David Stone, and like naming the lead investors and stuff like that. It definitely creates this vision that it's not necessarily about comics, despite the fact that comic creators are involved. But if this is the big lie, if this is the idea that publishers, they can make riches every single time by just embracing the IP play, is not true, why do they keep pursuing the model? Like, what is it about that, like, that makes it something that you feel, is it just the lottery ticket and the idea that it could become something huge?
I think a lot of people want to be involved in comics and like pub making. I mean, look, Axel Alonso likes making comics. I mean, he's a great editor. And you know what? AWA put out some pretty good books, I mean, they weren't all bad. I'm doing it in the past tense because I don't actually know what's going on with them, but I know they are still publishing. They're still around and they haven't gone bankrupt. But, I mean, decent books come out of all these deals, but I think people want to be in comics. And in order to get the money to make comics, they have to sell it as an IP form. And that's how they get the money to come in.
So I want to talk about the other side of this, because I think the thing that's really concerning about all of this is, like, as often as you have good lifelong comics people like Philip Sablik or like Jamie S. Rich involved, there's also some of these companies that come in and behave in a predatory fashion where maybe they're not looking out for the best in creators. What do you think that these types of things, like the what kind of environment do you think the big lie perpetuates?
I mean, I think it does perpetuate this atmosphere of people signing up for these, signing away their rights. I mean, look at Action Lab, look at Action Lab and Scout. I mean, here are two. And I mean, Scout seems to have done right by some people, but then they gave the rights back. But then they also said, oh, we can't do this. We need to hold on to them. And so, for them, it's like the cycle that happens is that this company launches, they get some money, they burn through it, they publish some books. All of a sudden, they're not selling enough books. And so they're like, oh shit, what are we going to do? And things slow down. And then in order to get the money to dig them out of the hole, they have to hold on to those media rights because that's the only thing they have to sell to the people with money is the media rights. So that ends up with the Scouts and the Action Labs just, sitting on these things because somebody's going to come along and suddenly option Battle Board, Battle Pig, whatever it is, but as that story from Rob Williams reveals, the option money isn't really that much money, It's like, yeah, sure, you keep getting this check, but it's not, the perfect example for me is The Boys, okay? And, Garth Ennis has been through the rodeo many times. And again, I'm sure he makes, he got a good purchase price. The Preacher got made, ran for several seasons.
I think it had like 3 seasons, which is pretty wild.
Yeah. And The Boys is obviously really one of the breakout hits for Amazon. But let's roll it back. Let's look at the publisher, Dynamite. I mean, if you remember, The Boys started out at Wildstorm. It was a DC comic. And, but it was too hot to handle. So then they were like, okay, we're not going to publish it. Somebody else. And so Dynamite picked it up. And I guarantee that when Nick Perucci bought this comic, bought the rights, he was thinking about selling copies of The Boys.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it's a very successful periodical comic. And then the trades come out and I'm sure they were selling what a Garth Ennis trade sells. And then this TV show comes out and Dynamite, I mean, he's talked about making this big bet on having to print them here in the United States because they didn't have enough time from Amazon. Because the streamers don't tell you when these are coming out, right? But he made the big bet. And guess what? They sold like gangbusters. And The Boys is one of the best-selling comics.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would say that, I mean, as much as people love Preacher, and I love Preacher, I would say The Boys has made Garth Ennis several orders of magnitude more for him than Preacher has, more than likely.
But it's through the book sales.
Right, exactly. The interesting thing about this is, I think you're right. I think the big lie is, like, I've talked to creators where it's basically you have to look at option money and like adaptation money as like a nice little bonus, but you can't like build everything off of it. And the thing that's interesting is that publishers don't really have that same mentality where, and not all publishers, there are some publishers that don't necessarily always behave like that, but it is kind of interesting where the higher up the flagpole you go, it seems like the more the pursuit becomes that lottery ticket rather than like building sustainability where, I don't know, in a weird way, it's kind of like, you know, in direct market comics, the idea is that single issue comic sales give you that cash flow to get you to the trade paperback, which is where you can really make the money. In a weird way, these publishers seem like they should look at building a really sustainable comic model and then kind of looking to do the IP plays, quote unquote. I hate saying all these words. I hate these words, but it's true.
But it is so true. This is such a huge part. It's like that, you know, it was really eye-opening to me when I talked to the dude at Atlas Comics and I said, why are you getting into comics publishing? And he said, it's not the best business, but comics are an important part of the ecosystem. Look at Ecos. Look at that. Look at David Mizell.
Oh, that was a funny one to me. Yeah.
Okay. And Ecos. I mean, this is a perfect example. Like he has this property. He's gone in with Aspen Publishing. This was created by Michael Turner before he passed away, which is almost 20 years ago. And, you know, David Mizell, he really wants to get his name out there again because he was the co-creator of the MCU. But Kevin Feige, you know, is pretty much stolen. I mean, Mizell has a place in the story and his place should not be forgotten, but he's really out there trying to get his name out there again with Ecos. And, you know, they're doing a Kickstarter to do the comics and they spent ungodly amounts of money on promotion at San Diego. And, you know, what do you think they're trying to do? They're trying to make, I mean, he says, we want animation, we want movies. It's a whole tentpole. Okay. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Will it be a tentpole? So it's really, I mean, look, I've done it. I mean, I've worked in freelance, you know, I take on freelance jobs here and there, editing stuff. And I've edited several comics that were, you know, let's put out the comic and see if we could use that as the Bible to sell it as a movie. And a lot of people make, you know, writers, that's what they do. They write these movie comics, I call them, you know?
It is interesting that probably the most prominent names you can think of involving all of this and adaptations and stuff in terms of benefiting from it are actually creators. We haven't mentioned Mark Miller. I mean, Mark Miller, this is his bread and butter for like a long time now. And not only did Mark Miller make a lot of money off of his Netflix deal, but so did a lot of artists.
Yes.
I say this with respect. For what? Not much.
But I mean, that deal is over. And now, you know, yeah, the deal is over. And, you know, let's look at Dark Horse. So all of his Netflix books are at Dark Horse now. He moved them from Image to Dark Horse. And man, there's so many steps of this. It's like, I need to do my year in review and like looking at all these different things that happened. It's just like, oh man, I got to take notes. But, you know, Dark Horse had some of the biggest early successes in the whole comic book era of movies with Sin City and then 300 and Hellboy.
Right.
And guess what? They sold tons and tons and tons of comics because the thing is that when the adaptation is close to the source material, people will go seek out the source material. So people bought tons of 300s. People bought tons of Sin City. People bought a lot of Hellboy when those first hit and were huge, right? Now, it doesn't work for the MCU. And Marvel has been held back by that they can't put things up. You know, they don't really hold back stock. So they can't just, you know, Scarlet Witch and, you know, The Vision. That show was definitely inspired by the Vision miniseries by Tom King and Gabriel Walter. So that one people would have picked up, but they didn't get to reprint it in time. So it came out later. I wrote a whole article about this for PW, that how streamers don't let you know in time for you to put in a print order. I
mean, they should have. I mean, we knew that was coming for a long time. The WandaVision didn't exactly sneak up on people. Right. But I do think it's interesting, though. I like not to make the complete aside, but I do think that to some degree, it isn't necessarily about closeness to the source material that makes it easier for people to pick up. It's the ability to like point at something and say, this is like a good fit. Long Halloween or Batman Year One, are those really that similar to Robert Pattinson and Matt Reeves' The Batman? Not really, no. But at the same time, it's easy to guide somebody from one to the next one because they feel similar. And I think one of the big problems for Marvel is the fact that they don't have any standalone books, so you can just be like, you should read this.
Well, they're trying now with their premiere. They're trying to put out this line of comics that will be like, oh, this is our library of perennial classics. The biggest example next to Walking Dead is Watchmen, right? Mm-hmm. Because when the movie came out, there was a frenzy. They put 1 million copies. It sold like literally 1 million copies. And it sold 1 million copies because it is a masterpiece. Okay.
Yeah. And it's one book. You just buy one book.
Now, I want to point this out because you and I were talking a little bit, but I want to point to the world of publishing because, see, this is the thing. It's like the big lie is so common in comics and you see it in other places, but not as much because traditional publishers do not rely on media rights to be successful. So PW today just had the list of the biggest publishers of I guess all this money, was it for this year? Fiscal 2023. Biggest publisher in the world is the Relix Group, RELX Group. Do you know that? Do you know what that is? You never heard of it.
Have you?
Of course. I used to work for them.
Oh.
Because they own ReadPop.
Oh, I had no idea.
Relix Group is Reed Elsevier.
Okay.
They own ReadPop. They used to own Publishers Weekly, where I worked, and they made, in 2023, they made $6.2 billion in revenue. Now, what do they publish? They publish scientific STM, science, tech, and medical manuals, okay? They publish books that I guess are incredibly expensive. Go to libraries, go to doctors. They publish medical journals. They publish technical publishing. They do not have any movies based on anything.
Those would be some boring ass movies. I'm not going to lie.
Yes. And they publish incredibly boring books. It's B2B. They are a B2B company.
I cannot believe that they made $6.3 billion on that. That's wild. You're blowing my mind right now.
Yeah. The second is Thomson Reuters. And I don't actually even know what they do. They made $6 billion. I guess they're the same. They're a tech publisher. Third on the list is Bertelsmann, which is Random House. They made 5.9. It's almost $6 billion last year in 2023. Okay. Now, when a Here movie was coming out, based on Here, the graphic novel by Richard Maguire, a movie came out directed by Robert Zemeckis, starring Tom Hanks and Robin Wright, and a complete reunion of the Forrest Gump crew, one of the most beloved movies of all times, not by me, but by many. And did you ever see Random House send out any PR saying, hey, we're re-releasing Here in the movie edition?
No, I suspect it had something to do with the fact that they saw the movie because based on most accounts, it was a horror show, but still.
Yes, exactly. But I'm just saying they didn't even have to gamble. It would have cost them. I mean, I think there is an edition that says now a major motion picture on it. Okay.
Actually,
that's fair.
I saw a big stack of them at Barnes & Noble the other day.
Okay. So they did do a laydown for it. They probably went in their catalog to bookstores, which is essentially Barnes & Noble, and said, hey, there's the movie coming out, 6 months ago, and, you should probably order some. So they did. They did do a promotion for it, for sure. For sure they did. But it's like we didn't hear about it, right? So when I was watching the Oscars this year, they announced the Best Animated Film nominees, which, we'd been covering this. I didn't actually write the story about the Oscar nominees, but, we always shout out the animation and, it's Into the Spider-Verse or, a lot of them were based on comics.
There was like 3 of them, I think, this year.
Yeah. And they showed the little clips, and they showed a little clip from one called Robot Dreams. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Cecil Castellucci.
No, it's Sarah Varon.
Oh, wait, I thought they both did it.
Oh, I don't know, Cecil. I believe it was just Sarah. Yeah. Maybe Cecil had her own Oscar nominee, though.
Oh, no. It was Sarah Varon. I'm mixing up. It was another book that Sarah Varon and Cecil Castellucci did together.
Yes, they did collaborate, but that is not the book. The book came out years ago from First Second, and it's wonderful. And I love Sarah Varon. She's fantastic. We all said she's one of the best cartoonists out there. And I ran into her at Mocha, and I was like, well, congratulations. I mean, that's pretty cool. And I said, did they do any promotion for this? And she says, oh, not really. And I saw that there had been a in conversation between Sarah and Andy Stevenson, whose Nimona was also nominated for an Oscar for Best Nominated Picture. So they did a little in conversation talking about it. But, for a second, I was never sent out an email to me about Robot Dreams being an Oscar nominee. Now, partially it's because it was a foreign film that hadn't been released in the United States. But I'm just saying, they made a whole freaking movie out of it.
And it was nominated for an Oscar.
And nominated for an Oscar. And the publisher basically didn't do that much promo about it. And I'm not even faulting them for it. I'm just saying it's not their business.
Right, because they want to make money off of the adaptation, not off of the comic. So bring it back to The Big Lie. I think part of the reason why The Big Lie is perpetuated and why the pursuit of the adaptation supersedes the pursuit of the publishing model is you're talking about the biggest publishers in the world, and their total revenue was $6.3 billion for doing a bunch of boring-ass textbooks, which is great. That's fantastic. An Avengers movie made $2 billion by itself. And I think that they get distracted by the ceiling and ignore the floor because of that. And that's how you become an unsuccessful comic publisher.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that they get the stars dancing in their eyes. It is true. You can make money. You can make money with media. Adaptations of comics have made tons of money. Some of the greatest, like Walt Disney, a lot of them were based on, they took ideas of the Karl Barks stuff, and it goes both ways. Like the influence is there. But, I just saw somebody posting Tom Scioli's Fantastic Four. What's the book from Marvel that he did?
Oh, it's Fantastic Four Grand Design, right?
Mm-hmm. And like somebody was saying that the director of the Fantastic Four movie was saying what a great book it is. So I'm like, oh, so Tom Scioli was your unpaid, uncredited art director. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very uncool. I mean.
Yeah. I do think it's worth noting that from a broader comic book ecosystem, do you view The Big Lie and the trend of publishers pursuing adaptations above all as an unhealthy thing for the overall comic world?
I'm glad you asked that because I do think that unfortunately it is a necessary evil at this point because all of the money, there's a lot of money pouring into the comics industry right now. And we'll see how it goes with what looks like some very different economic times upcoming, right? Looks like we're going to have a big change to our economy. I do think it's going to continue to come in. So it's kind of, it's like Rob Williams and enjoying that option money. It's not what he can count on, but it is money that comes in that he's glad to get. So it's like variant covers. One thing about the variants is that artists make a lot of extra money from doing variant covers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's part of the ecosystem of the comics industry, even though we don't like it. The Big Lie, I think at the end of the day, it's very perilous and that creators do need to be very aware. Like, there was this list of, bodies they made. I need to reach out and find out. I'm going to investigate more. There will be a beat post about this when this podcast comes out, because I've been meaning to explore this and get a little more behind the scenes. But, Bodies came out. That was a Vertigo comic book. And I'm just curious, how much money do you think they got from that? How much money do you think the creators got from that? So I think creators go into it with the rolling the dice, buying a lottery ticket as well, a lot of times. And, maybe the creators of Bodies were very, very well aware. I think most well-established creators at this point are aware that they might not have life-changing money from an option.
I believe Bodies was another one that was out of print when it hit too, which is another bring. I mean, that is the interesting thing is like, I think that there's an ideal world where, it's a big lie for these for these publishers that are trying to like get rich quick with intellectual property plays. But there is also a very idealistic world where this benefits the creators, where their books sell more because of it, where they get, regular option money, like the perpetual option money that Rob Williams was talking about, things like that it can benefit not just these lottery ticket obsessed like publishers. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily how it always is. Last question for you. Do you think that there needs to be a greater balance where like maybe these publishers need to be a little bit more conscientious of the environment they're getting themselves into to try to survive beyond spray and pray, hoping for the best adaptations?
Yes, I do. I don't think there's even any question about it, that the ones that survive are the ones who have a well-founded and diverse business plan, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to make your biggest amount of money by having a hit comic book and a hit graphic novel that becomes a perennial bestseller and keeps selling and selling and selling. And when I do Global Comics, they had their digital charts. I was doing them for a while and we're revamping them right now. But, the top was always Invincible and The Boys and Walking Dead #1 and all these things. Yes. So look, I think creators would love to be a household name. The Boys, people have those memes, Homelander, all of them. Those characters are really embedded in pop culture now. Same thing with The Walking Dead. Everybody knows them. So yes, obviously it's great to dream of that, of creating something that becomes part of the monoculture, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think publishers, look, it's not going to stop, David. I mean, they're streaming in every day.
It's probably going to get worse. Or, more at the very least.
Yeah, we just saw Heavy Metal and Metal Hurlant come back, with their Kickstarters. And, I guarantee somewhere in the business plan is media rights.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors in Oni Press. 20 years, 7 evil X's, one huge celebration. Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life was released on August 18, 2004, and for the 20th anniversary, creator Brian Lee O'Malley designed some outstanding new merch. Pre-order is now open on the official Scott Pilgrim 20th Century merchandise line, celebrating 20 years of the iconic Scott Pilgrim series with a selection of brand new and classic designs newly remastered by O'Malley himself. Listeners of Off Panel can use the code SKETCHED15, that's SKTCHD, all caps 15, for 15% off their order of exclusive Scott Pilgrim merch at onipress.com. But hurry, this pre-order closes on December 2nd. And now, back to the show. That was The Beat's Heidi MacDonald. And now, to close this episode, we have writer Joshua Williamson of G.I. Joe and Superman fame, who joins me to talk about the power of big swings and how that shaped the year in comics, and maybe the ones going forward. I am here with writer Joshua Williamson, and we were just talking before we started recording about how when he was trying to come up with his theme, he was kind of struggling with it. What was leading your thinking as you're trying to come up with something? Because you did come up with something.
Yeah, I feel like, when I got back from New York Comic Con, I felt like I had this kind of very zen, positive attitude about everything. Even the things that I thought were kind of negative, or things I saw like in comics that might be negative, I sort of hit this weird like zen attitude about it. And I think when we started talking, I am in a very positive place compared to where I was, I think, the last time we talked. Because last time we talked, I was pretty burnt out. And so there was a part of me that was like, oh, do we do a theme about burning out? Do we do a thing about staying positive? Do we do a thing? One of the things you and I talked about was possibly doing something about change or die, right? But my opinions on people talking about comics dying, I always kind of scoff at that,
Yeah.
And so it was like, that didn't feel right either. And then it was sort of like, I think one of the things I started picking up on a lot, and we'll talk about this after New York Comic Con, but I really did start, the conversation I've had with other creators and things I've noticed, it really was a bit of go big or go home. I feel like we're at this moment where there is change happening in comics. Like there's a lot of big change. And when I look out at everything that's going on and sort of the stuff that I notice, the things that I want to do, that's why I eventually settled on the go big or go home sort of thing, because of my experiences at New York and San Diego, but just sort of the stuff I've been looking at. But yeah, it was interesting trying to come up with a theme that also I feel like it boiled down to a few sentences. I was kind of all over the place because I was thinking about a lot of things. If we're talking about kind of an end of the year viewpoint, I have a lot of thoughts, I guess, but most of them are positive. Like, I think that's one of the weird things. I think the last time you and I talked again, I was fairly negative the last time we talked.
You were also in a much different place because you were writing more books. You were just, I think, finishing up Dark Crisis, but also kind of leading into...
Was that long ago?
God, you're leading into... I'm sorry, I always forget the name. What was the Nightmare?
Oh, Night Terrors, yeah.
Night Terrors, yeah. You were leading into that. And so it was like, you had like this royal suite of things going on. There was just like a ton of stuff. And so I think that now you have a little room to breathe. You probably have a clearer view on things and how they're going. But so you ended up with Go Big or Go Home.
Yeah.
Why is that the theme of the year for comics from your perspective?
Oh, even just from I guess I say joking perspective, but I think it is very serious, is looking at the success of Absolute Batman. That was something very beginning with Scott. And I think that when him and I started talking about what the Absolute universe is going to be and how those books were going to go, and, Scott always likes to talk about taking big swings. And I think it goes beyond just taking the big swings. I think you really do have to try to go big, and you look at what's working right now. You look at stuff that's working with Energon Universe. You look at what's going on with Absolute. You look at stuff that's working with James, and James is big. Like his empire is big, like he doesn't mess around. And I think on the flip side of that, when I see a lot of books, they feel very quiet. And I think you're in this weird moment where it's like you have to be kind of noisier than the noise, And I think that what's going on with monthly books and how something has to happen every month in your book, like you're fighting for things. But it's interesting. Like I feel like, I don't know, I think there are some books that when I read, they feel very quiet. And so when I look at what's been working this year, it is this kind of like, you gotta go big with everything. I mean, again, like look at what's been launching. You have things like Energon Universe, Absolute, Ghost Machine, people are going big with things. Ultimate. Yeah. It's interesting to see where it's not these like small lines, and not to say that there aren't books that are working that are smaller. I'm going to use an example here. Maybe it is the best example, but I look at stuff like Ice Cream Man, which is on issue 43. It's like, that's a book that's just doing its thing. It's been doing its thing for a long time and it's working. But then I look at something like Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, right? And it's like, that book was a big hit this year. But, so those things are still working on. That has to be a shared universe, is guess what I'm saying. But when I look at something like that book in particular, which is probably, you and I talked about this last week, I think that was probably one of my maybe top 5 books this year was Beneath the Trees, But even that book, I mean, you could tell, like, look at what IDW did with Ninja Turtles. Like, they went really big with it, It's like everyone's out there. And I think that's something I'm looking at these trends. And my biggest hope is that all this stuff is getting people into comic book stores. And then you get people going to the comic stores. And then we get that system again of, I think one of the things we lost during the pandemic was, and I'll use this it's a dated example, but I'll use the example, is that like people would go into comic book stores and they'd be like, I love Batman. And they'd like, great, here's Scott Snyder's Batman. And then they would read Scott Snyder's Batman, they would love it. And they'd come back into the comic book store and they go, I love that. What's next? And they'd be like, well, here's Witches. And they'd be like, great, I love Witches. What's next? Here's Nailbiter. Lack of a better phrase, there was a trickle-down effect when it comes to these books. And I think we really lost that the last few years. And so what I'm seeing is, dude, I think, man, for me, again, going with Absolute Batman and how big Absolute Batman got. And it's actually like built in the DNA of that book, where it's like everything about that book is about Batman going bigger, right? Bigger logo, bigger body, it's so much of that. But I look at that and it's like that worked really well. And I could see that across all the comics. Even when I went to San Diego and New York, you could see what was going on. Like, DC had a bigger booth this year and they've had in a very long time, like a huge booth at San Diego. When I go to my signings, whether it's at a convention or a store, I can see how like the lines are bigger, right? The crowd is bigger, and it's been really, I don't know, rewarding. I definitely, we talked about this 2 years ago. I was really in the middle of the burnout pretty bad. And so I started making decisions at the beginning of the year to I was like the opposite though. I was like trimming down my workload, because I went from doing 10 books a month to now doing a lot less, right? So in some ways I was like the opposite of going bigger, but what I was doing was I was looking at what I wanted to do and then going bigger within those places, right? I think it was something you and I had talked about with Kieran.
Yeah.
I think we've talked about this. Maybe this might be public, but there was a time where Kieran was like going to do a ton of books.
Oh, yeah. That's public.
That's public. And then decided to trim it down. And I remember thinking about that because I was in a very similar spot. And this was around that same time that we had all talked. And I was like, he's right. But at the same time, you take those books and you go bigger with those books. You don't have to do 10 books. But yeah, I don't know. I just look at what's going on in comics. And when I was at New York looking around, and it was fascinating to see this sort of change. Because one of the things that I saw a lot in comics this year were people making fun of things that were working. And I thought that was sort of fascinating to me. And things I would hear privately where people were kind of clowning on things that were working. And I'd be like, what is it about that? And it's like, oh, because they don't want to go big.
There's like 3 things with that. One, I think people clowning on stuff. I kind of talked about this with Steve Anderson in the first segment of this podcast, but I think people clowning on stuff and ripping on stuff is actually an offshoot of the success. People talk about it because they're aware of it, and awareness is a huge part of the game right now. Then The other thing too is like, I think that people might hear go big or go home and think that could mean just do more, do more, do more. It's not about doing more. It's about bigger swings. And like part of the reason why all those like Energon and Ultimate and Absolute have done so well, I think, is because they're small focus lines, micro lines, as I call them. They're just focused on big books that do big new things with great creators. And I think that is a big part of it. And then last part, I do think that there is the trickle down effect you're talking about is real. And I think a great example of that is Daniel Warren Johnson. Daniel Warren Johnson was doing Transformers, and that was just killing it. Still is doing Transformers. But then he did The Moon is Following Us with Riley Rossmo. And from what I've heard, that was one of the bigger launches for creator-owned stuff this year. And it's done pretty well. I do think that Go Big or Go Home isn't just about size. It's about being deliberate with your big swings and finding the right fit at the right time.
Yeah, it's about being strategic and capitalizing. It's something that I kind of regret because I never planned for that. It's funny, obviously, we talk about how James is very strategic and very thoughtful and sort of games out every little piece. For me, it's like, because I was doing so much the last couple of years, I started trimming up. In an ideal world, I would have a new creator-owned book launching like 2 months from now. I would have something launching.
Gotta get on that G.I. Joe heat, man.
I know. Well, it's, I'm really glad that G.I. Joe has done really well. But it's that thing where you look at the way the Voice Rivals launched. And yeah, it was a big swing, like for Robert to keep it secret the way he did and then surprise everybody. Well, that's really striking when the iron is hot. And then to go from that to Transformers, but then kind of break your own rules right after that and do something unexpected again. It was interesting when Transformers came out, we announced the Duke and Cobra Commander books, there was a lot of people being like, why didn't you do G.I. Joe #1 now? That'd be the obvious thing. And the stuff that we would always talk about was like, well, yeah, that would be the obvious thing to do.
That's why you don't do it.
That's why you don't do it. And that's just what's been on my mind a lot lately too. It's funny, like my opinion on stuff, my advice to other creators and all that stuff has changed so much in the last year. And it's funny because now whenever people ask me for advice on writing or breaking into comics or anything, I'm fine talking about my experience and the things that I have done. But then I also sort of like, I wouldn't say I'd be the negative one on a panel about breaking in, but I guess what I would say is like, don't listen to anything anyone's telling you. Everybody is wrong. And the reason why I say that, the reason why I say don't listen to anybody and everybody is wrong is because I say this all the time to people, but like once you start following somebody else's path, you're always behind, right? You have to find your own way, your own thing. And it's so fascinating to me to be like, every success story on the planet, part of that success story is that person saying, oh, and this person told me I was dumb for doing this. This person told me not to do it. Right. So it's like if everyone is telling you that it's interesting now where it's like looking at comics and how often people are like, well, don't do that. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. And then somebody does it and it's a success. It's so fascinating to see that and to see that math constantly happen in comics. And so my attitude has changed so much where it's like, I'm again in this like Zen kind of positive place where it's even with stuff, I just look at everything and I'm like, I'm just glad people are making comics and they're doing big stuff. And it's even if it isn't for me, I'm glad it exists. And I think again, like when I did 3 store signings in 4 days in different stores. And people were super pumped about comics at all 3 stores. Obviously, one of them is Third Eye. Third Eye does some of the best signings in the United States, and he really goes for it. But you can just see people buying books, and that trickle down effect is happening. And that's what my big hope is. I think I talked before where it's like when New 52 happened, it was definitely something people clowned on, but it got people in stores. And then when Saga launched right after, it was really able to capitalize on that. Mm-hmm. And, Image really was able to put out a lot of books. And I do feel like we're back in that spot where it's like all of these big books that are coming through from Ultimate to Energon to Absolute. Because I think arguably you could say those are the 3 biggest things this year, right? Like those 3 things. My hope is those 3 things then lead to somebody else picking up other stuff. Like maybe they get Nailbiter, maybe they get Beneath the Trees, maybe they pick up like the Dwellings hardcover from Oni, And again, it's like you look at stuff that Ghost Machine is doing, that they have so many great creators over there doing their books that it's like you just hope that people keep on picking stuff up. And it's like, oh, if you're into what they're doing, then you can look at the massive universe and pick up Radiant Black. And, but again, it's like even look at what Kyle's been doing with Radiant Black, where it's like he keeps building out this universe. It's still, you can still just read Radiant Black if you wanted, but then it was like he did an experiment where it's split into two for a while, for a few months. And again, that all fed into the idea of like just going big for me. I mean, that's part of why I didn't want to do Change or Die. Because when I was in New York, I was listening to other creators and I started seeing the places that were sort of being negative. And it was really fascinating to watch a lot of what I was hearing negativity about was what you said. It was like negativity about things that were working.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't understand where this is coming from. But it reminds me of Robert said years and years ago, like in an interview Kirkman said, where he was like, if all you get is good reviews, that means no one's reading your book. And I think about that all the time, where it's like, I'll hear stories about like people loving this book. They love it. And then you find out the sales on it and it's like the worst sales it's ever had. And you're like, oh, okay. It might be because only the diehards are reading it at this point, right? You're not hitting that bigger audience. Like one of the things I sort of came to the conclusion over the last year was that, like, not a conclusion, just a thought I had this last year about a lot of stuff. It was sort of like good or bad doesn't mean anything anymore. It's like, because everyone's opinions are all over the place and what good or bad means at this point. I essentially came around to is like, are you connecting with a wide enough audience? It's like, it's something I've watched creators struggle with. It's fascinating because it's like, if you're aiming for a niche audience, you should expect niche numbers, niche money. It's like, it really just comes down to that. Are you connecting with people? Like, it doesn't matter what you're making. Are you connecting with the big enough audience that can sustain itself? That's really kind of it.
I think that one thing that fits into this that we haven't really talked about, because it's not a single issue thing, is the DC Compact comics were probably the other biggest hit from the year, at least from what I understand.
Oh, yeah. I love them.
Every retailer I talk to is just like, I can't even keep them on the stands.
It's funny. I know there's a couple of retailers that hate it.
Well, yeah. I mean, the same thing, right? It's like, there's always going to be somebody that hates.
It's something that works. It was interesting the last couple of years, like watching the different stuff and wanting to read between the lines and some of the comments that are made about things. But I saw those books at ALA. It was the first time I saw it in person was at ALA. And people at ALA were pumped about those books. And when I had them in my hand, I was like, dude, yes, this is rad. How do I get these? How do I get my books made like this? Like, I was like, yes, let's do this.
So there's two things about that I think really work. One is, even though, I mean, they literally do not go big, they went smaller, but it's going different. It's like it's counter programming what has always worked in the direct market. That isn't always going to work. I think a good theme for the year is that you kind of talked about it before. It's like doing what's kind of not expected. And then that pops because it feels different. It feels exciting and it feels like inspires passion. But then the other thing about it too is like, I've talked to some retailers who said, I want more books. They need to start just filling the market with these. I think that would be a mistake. They have to be selective and they have to like roll it out in a strategic way. And by choosing to not go big, they're actually succeeding by not spamming the market. And I don't know. I mean, I do think it's interesting. I do want to ask a question about this theme. When it comes to go big or go home, do you mean primarily for creators, for publishers, or really for everyone?
Really for everybody. I know everybody can't. And it's like, we have so many publishers now. There's so many publishers. And in some cases, I wish those publishers would just focus on just making good books. It's silly because it's like, nobody sets out to make a bad book. Nobody goes and says, here's my goal for the day. But I think they sometimes get caught up in gimmicks. And it's like, I just want you to make monthly comics that have legs. That's the thing I look at a lot lately is, does this have legs? Does this lead to something else? Okay, I'm going to go on a weird tangent here for a moment. As we've been talking, I've been thinking about a bunch of different stuff. I have questions for you about your take on as well. So Disney, everything Disney does is about getting you into the parks, right?
Right.
Everything they do is about, they are trying to get you to buy something that will then make you buy something else. It's like, oh, you're going to go watch this movie. Well, after you see that movie, you paid for that movie. Now you want to buy the toy. Now you want to go to the park so you can ride that ride or meet that character, right? Like, there's always some kind of direction they send you in. And I think comics work on the same level. And so when I'm looking at a lot of stuff, I always think about that, where I'm like, does this lead you to just buy that book monthly? Does it lead you to buy the trades? Does it lead you to buy compact editions? Because I think compact editions will turn people who may not have read that story before into regular comic book readers. Like, I was thinking about this a lot lately, where it's like, I'm glad that there are books that exist that do this, but I think we had a lot more of them. When I was a kid, I knew what Preacher was. So I got it backwards. I started reading Hitman first. And I was really into Hitman because, I was a 90s DC kid. So it was like, I love Bloodlines, and then Bloodlines led to Hitman. And I was reading Hitman and I'm like, this book is amazing. And I was working at the store at the time and somebody was like, you should pick up Preacher. So I bought the first trade of Preacher, freaking loved it, read the second one, loved it. And then I was like, what's next? And it was like, oh, the issues are here. Well, now I'm a monthly reader of Preacher, right? And I read Preacher and Hitman, and then Hitman ended, and then I kept reading Preacher, and then people forget this, but Punisher was coming out the same day, the Welcome Back Frank stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So you would literally it'd be this whole thing of like, which do I read first? Welcome Back Frank or Preacher today, right? Like that Wednesday. I think that we have kind of lost that in some ways. I think we've lost that sort of pattern. There are people doing it, especially like James does it with Something Is Killing the Children. And I think, again, there's something you can say for like Ice Cream Man and a few other image properties that you could do that with. But we used to have a lot of them. Yeah, there used to be a lot more of those kinds of things. You had Walking Dead, Invincible, Vertigo, when Saga was still a little more on the monthly side. I still think Saga does that clearly. Like Brian K. Vaughan is one of the masters, I think, of that routine. But it's like I think we used to have a lot more of those kinds of things than we do now.
I really think that connectivity is super important, and it's something that has been lost to some degree. I have an oddball pick for you for something I think is reflective of the Go Big or Go Home, and it ties to this. This is something I really like. I actually think, and I know people think it's a gag, I think Chip Zdarsky Comic News is actually one of the smartest things of the year.
Listen, I was so fucking angry with him because it is such a good idea. It is such a good idea. It made me so mad so fast. I texted him immediately. I was like, you fucker. It is so smart.
Right. Well, and also it builds that connectivity because in every single issue, it's here are the things from Chip you can buy. And some of the people who are picking that up aren't Chip Zdarsky readers. They're just like, I like free things. I'm going to pick this up. And then next thing you know, you're like, I like this. I'm going to pick up Public Domain. I'm going to pick up Daredevil. I'm going to pick up whatever. And like, that's good for Chip and that's good for comics. And I think there's a real reason. Like, I think one of the most shocking things about it is like when you pick up number 4, the fourth one that came up has a full page ad for Absolute Superman. It has a full page ad for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers from Boom. And it's because they recognize the value and they want to tap into that.
I have talked to Chip about this extensively because I was legit angry when it was announced. I mean, it's funny now that we're talking about this. I almost feel like the theme is changing to like do the thing people tell you not to do. I imagine Chip told somebody and they were like, "Don't do that, stupid. Why would you do that?
Yeah, you're wasting money.
You're wasting money. You're wasting time." And then he does it. I've had this thing lately, and this may be a chicken and the egg question for you about how like oftentimes I find that people in comics, and this goes across the board, so it's like creators, readers, retailers, every single person that's in comics, they want to put things in a box. They want things in a box. But every time somebody does something outside the box, it becomes successful, right? Like every time somebody's like, I'm doing something outside the box, people latch onto it or they see the specialness of it. They see why it's different. You know, that's the compact edition. That's the absolute ultimate engine. Every time somebody goes, oh, I'm doing something outside the box, it does well. But here's my question for you. Does that mean that we have to have the box?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. But it's weird though, because that makes it that some things have to fit that. Here's the challenge with this. There are people who love the box.
Here's the other thing too, is at a certain point, if everything you're doing is outside the box becomes the box.
I was thinking about this a lot when I was in New York and looking at the stuff that's going on. And I was like, oh, I guess you kind of need the box. You can have the stuff outside the box. You know, you kind of have to go, I guess to go big, you have to have things that are small.
Well, so I think you had a good example with Breaking In. Like Breaking In is an oddly nice comp to this because one of the things people have always told me is as soon as you break in one way, like let's say you take this door, that door is closed and you have to find a new door. And I think it's the same thing where it's not just go big or go home, and it's not just don't do the things that everyone tells you not to do or do the things that people tell you not to do. It's just like you have to find an angle that fits. And I think that that's one of the cool things about 2024 is I think there have been a lot of really great examples of creators and publishers finding their own door and doing something cool with it. I mean, we've talked about a number of them, but like I think The Power Fantasy is a super interesting book from Kieran Gillen and Casper Wingard. And I do think it's like an example of a book that might have been faced with a market that was very risk averse because the first print sold out really fast, but then it kept selling more prints and it kept selling more prints and it kept selling more prints. And I do think that, God, I'm really mixing metaphors now. When you close those doors, you start opening other doors and it makes it pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of look out there. And I think, again, it's like now it is interesting though, like success brings criticism, right? It always does. But what I often find is people are criticizing the stuff before it even happens. But yeah, it's fascinating to me the amount of people like, oh, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, I had a very good friend tell me, do not write Superman. Don't write Superman. Don't do it. And I was like, well, here's my pitch for it. Here's what I'm thinking. And they were like, that's cool. Don't do it. Just don't do it. And then you fast forward like a year and a half and they came to me and they said, I was wrong. Like they were like, I was wrong, you know, and Superman is one of my like bigger hits for DC, you know, like it sells really well and it's easily the most consistently well reviewed book, but also it's one of the ones that people will come to me and be really happy with, you know, like, because the thing I judge, we had this conversation before, like I don't live on the internet really, you know, it's like, that's what Tyler, my assistant who also does Scott's stuff. He runs all of that for almost 10 years now. I haven't really looked. But when I go to conventions, when I go to conventions and signings and stuff, I see what people bring to me and I see what they get excited about and what they want to talk about. And that was one of them. But it was an example, like if I had taken that person's advice and been like, because there's a thing, a lot of times that advice is for themselves, not for you. And this is why I was saying before about like, everyone is kind of wrong, because it's like, and weird when people give you advice, they're coming at it from all these different perspectives. Cause it's like, is it the same advice you would have given me 10 years ago where you're at in your career? But in that moment, it's like, what they were really saying was they had no interest in doing Superman. They didn't want to do Superman. Right. It's like, well, you don't want to do it then because I wouldn't do that. And it's like, well, I'm going to do it. Same thing with like G.I. Joe and stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure people would have told me 5 years ago, don't do G.I. And then G.I. Joe is easily one of my highest selling comics I've ever worked on. Like, it's just this massive hit that people in the stores are really excited about. If I had taken those advice, a lot of the things that I'm super happy with right now, or even leaving books, like I left a lot of books. I left Green Arrow and Batman and Robin. And I had friends tell me not to leave Batman and Robin, but I was like, dude, it's time. Like I'm dying. I got to do something different. But yeah, going back to some of this stuff, it's funny because now I'm thinking that my advice, the theme is like, do you think people tell you not to do? Because I mean, that's even with with the compact editions. I'm sure there were people that were like, don't do this. Don't do this.
I'm sure that's happened for years. I mean, to be honest, there's long been a resistance to different formats because people, I mean, even compendiums, it kind of felt like sometimes it was like publishers thought that if they did compendiums, they'd be robbing the omnibus market that they can never keep in print anyway. So.
Oh, yeah. But we know that's not what happened. We know that's not what happened. Yeah. But yeah, with going big, I just feel like when I look at everything that's going on, and it's like, I guess what I say is like, maybe it has something to do with being brave. So you said like opening your own doors, being brave, going out there and doing your own thing. But then being like, how do I put this? Big chested about it. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
we could all learn from Absolute Batman in that regard. It's the biggest chest of them all.
That's phrase. I think it's maybe Ariana Grande said it. I'm all over the place with this, where it's like, say it with your whole chest.
Sure.
It's like that, where it's like, you got to be able to. I've always said this to people when they're talking to me about their new books. I'm like, can you get on a stage and talk about it? Can you get on a stage and like control that stage? And it's like, I know the times that I've seen that, and you can feel it. And it's like watching Scott get up and talk about Absolute Batman to a room full of people, and you can tell the energy there. And it's like, again, going to panels this year, and you can just see it, like there's a different energy to things. I've come across this. I mean, it's interesting talking to people, other creators who are in a much more negative place. And I'm in this really positive place right now. I mean, obviously it helps me have books that are selling and working that might give me a different perspective. And maybe because I'm doing less than I was a few years ago, that like now my new normal is better. But yeah, when I look at everything that's working, I'm just like, I think this is the pattern, is you got to just go for it. What are you waiting for? Like, just go big, like go out there and do your thing. Because look at Steve, man.
Steve Anderson from Third Eye.
Yeah. Like, look at the signings he does. And have you ever been to his store, the Superstore?
No.
Oh, dude. It's real cool.
I bet. I live in Alaska, man. It's a long ways.
I know you do. You gotta find a way to get out there, because it is crazy. But it's like, yeah, there's just such a cool energy to everything I'm watching now, when people are really going for it. Like, they're really being like, here's this big plan. Here's this thing I'm doing. You look at even these smaller, I don't want to say smaller, but you look at like what Rom is doing with New Gods, and it's like, have you read issue 1 yet? Has anyone sent that to you?
No, much to my chagrin. It's
very much one of my favorite things that Rom has done for DC. And he really hit that, like, the bigger the world, the smaller the story. That kind of level that like Saga brings, where at the end of the day, Saga is about two people in love on the run with the baby. Like,
yeah.
But then you put in these crazy set pieces for it. And I think that's something that, like, when I look at what Rom is doing with that book, it's the same thing, where it feels like he's really going big with something in that book. And yeah, I just feel like that's where I'm looking at stuff. It's like, that's why I didn't want to say change or die, because I didn't think that was necessarily fair either. I do think we are hitting a moment where things are changing in comics. There's a new generation of creators that are coming in, and there's things shifting around. And it's like, if you are a creator and you want to basically thrive in this environment, you got to kind of really go for it. Like, but take those big swings, You
got to give people a reason to do it. I mean, here's the thing, not to shift your point again, but honestly, I talked about this with Steve Anderson, when we were doing the first segment. And one of the things I told him is, I actually think one of the superpowers of Absolute Batman is it made people want to talk shit about it, basically, because like there's so many things that they're upset about. It was like, why is he so big? Why is that thing so big? Why is his chest thing so big? Ultimately, your goal is you have to make people feel something.
Oh yeah, because it connect with people.
You connect with people, yeah. But last question for you. You talk to a lot of people. You think about this stuff a lot. This has clearly been something that's been happening in 2024. Do you feel like this is something we're only going to see more of going forward?
Yes, because I think that the people who are paying attention are going to start, they're already coming to the conclusion of like, oh, this is working. This is what's working. So for good or bad, you're going to get people that you're going to get some copycats, I think, in this realm. But then you are going to get people that are going to feel what I'm hoping people feel. This is what I always feel like when this stuff happens. And this is how me and James and Scott always talk about these things. You feel challenged, but in a good way. You're like, oh, it's like that? Oh, I see how it is. You want to play like that? I can play like that too. Roll my fucking sleeves up and get in there and be like, oh, you want to fight? Let's fucking fight. And like that has always been, to quote one of my favorite movies of all time, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. Right? Like that's what I hope when these things happen. I hope when people look at it and they see the challenge of like, oh, you want to go big? I can go bigger. Yeah. Okay. You want to do that? Let's do that. I respond to that. That's how I am with things a lot of times. And so I'm hoping that's what I see. Like when I'm working with an artist and I turn a script and they come back with some stuff that like blows out what I was originally thinking, I'm like, oh, it's like that. I see how it is. You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. Like that's what I'm really hoping for with next year is I'm hoping people see this and they're kind of, even the people I feel have been kind of quiet the last couple of years, which is understandable. We went through a really hard time and comics is still in a hard time. I'm not going to deny it. But I do think the people who were kind of like just being quiet, for lack of a better phrase, I guess, or getting too deep into Black people's business, that they see it and they go, all right, like I feel challenged now. But instead of feeling challenged where they're going to go hide, they come out swinging and punching and being like, you want to go big? Let's go big. Let's do this. Like that's stuff I really respond to. So I'm hoping that's what I happens next year. And I do think you're going to see some of that. I know I'm like that. I feel like James Scott and I aren't really competitive with each other because we always cheerlead each other. But it is that thing where you're like, oh, you're doing that? I can do that.
Yeah.
When we were in the room together, we were very like improv. It was always yes and with the three of us. And that's what we built. A lot of the stuff we built at DC. That's how metal and death metal were built. And so it's like you can see that still to this day where it's like that kind of energy in our individual works. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping people it's like in on that. You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with retailer Steve Anderson, journalist Heidi MacDonald, and writer Joshua Williamson. You can find them on social media and their work at Third Eye Comics in Maryland and Virginia, the comics site The Beat, and G.I. Joe and Superman, respectively. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this episode. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Blue Sky and Instagram, or following me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Chris, Brian, David Byrne, Milton Lawson, David Wilson, Joe, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story Webcomic, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Tom Evans, Rita Beeman, Kelly Sudakonk, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Ryan Hole, Near Levy, Jason Hussick, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Klaus Vandeven, Submed Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Earl Kerschel, Robert Massella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon Pillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Susanna Polo, Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stephen Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pachalis, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Taw, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwald, Vita Yalik, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Jason Assey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Adam Heifel, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed op panels, outro, and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.